and welcome to the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast. I'm Erica O'Rourke, and our episode today is a conversation with Ariel Lawhon, author of Code Name Hélène, a novel based on the real-life adventures of Nancy Wake, a socialite turned World War II spy, who, despite being a key figure in the war, is rarely mentioned today. I had the pleasure of reading Code Name Hélène and was riveted by Nancy's story, from her start as a journalist to her time among French rebels. It's masterfully told, and Nancy is an incredible character, even more so when you consider that she was a real person. I was also profoundly moved by the story of Nancy's relationship with her husband Henri, from their initial meeting to their eventual marriage and their separation during Nancy's missions. It's a testimony to love, even under the most terrible conditions. Now, let's turn to my conversation with Ariel Lawhon, author of Code Name Hélène. I am delighted to welcome Ariel Lawhon to the show. Ariel, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Okay, so before we dive into the book, which I have been shoving into the hands of everyone I talk to, how are you and your family doing during the pandemic? You have four kids, right?
We have 4 boys, so they are aged roughly 11 to 17 right now, and it is no joke. They eat a lot, they argue a lot, and we've adapted, though. Okay, I mean, it's good that I like everyone that I have been quarantined with. I like my husband, I like children. We did lose our very long-term dog in the middle of all of it, which,
I'm so
in
hindsight,
it was heartbreaking. She was 13 years old, though, and she'd shown up at our door magically one day. So it was, it's part of life, but it was, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's probably going to be the thing that they struggle with most. I'm just trying to work.
I was going to ask if you were getting any writing done.
I have reverted back to the thing I did when they were all little babies. So we had all 4 of them in 5 years.
Oh, wow.
Which, yes, overachievers. And when they were little, finding time to write was really, really hard. Mm-hmm. So I used to look at the calendar, and if there was white space, I would throw myself at it. So that's kind of what I've returned to amidst all of this. And it might not be the most productive way to get a book written, but it works.
So I guess we should turn directly to the book. Can you tell us, obviously I've read it, but can you tell us more about the book and also just about Nancy Wake herself?
Yes. So like many people, I'd never heard of Nancy until, I want to say 2016. Dates, time, it's all a blur. All I know is that I was on book tour for my second novel, Flight of Dreams, and I was sitting in a hotel room all by myself in Buffalo, New York. I also happened to be the only person in the hotel, which wasn't creepy at all.
No.
So I was sitting in my room waiting for my event, and I got an email from the mother of a long-term friend of mine. Her name is Sally Burgess. And in this email, she sent me a link to the name of a woman, Nancy Wake. She said, Ariel, I don't know if you've ever heard of this woman. She's a legend down under. We love her there. Sally and my friend Christy are from New Zealand and Australia, respectively. And she's like, I think she'd make a really, really great subject for a novel. And also, if you don't write about her next, we can no longer be friends. No pressure. So I made a mental note of Nancy, and then I got back to work on the book that I was actually contracted for. But as soon as I finished, I returned immediately to Nancy Wake, and I knew that she was the perfect subject for a novel. She was this really bold, brassy, bawdy Australian expat living in France at the outbreak of the war. She'd just fallen in love with this French industrialist, and the Germans invaded France. And she was faced with one of those decisions that really everyone at that time was faced with. Step aside and do nothing, or do something. And Nancy Wake was not the kind of woman to sit there and do nothing. So she began smuggling documents and people across France. And she became so good at this in the early years of the war that she ended up with a 5 million franc price on her head and was labeled the most wanted person by the Gestapo. And that title held throughout the war in all theaters. She was their number 1 most wanted person. And then she became faced with the choice of, do I stay and continue my work, get arrested, and probably executed, or do I escape myself? So she decided to leave France, but she didn't stop her work. As soon as she escaped from France, she went straight to England. She went straight to the special operations executive and became a spy for the British, and ended up being parachuted back into France behind enemy lines and leading over 7,000 French resistance soldiers into battle against the Germans. And when you read about a woman like that, A, this really happened, and B, I've never heard of her, and C, how is she not a household name? I mean, little girls should be dressing up as Nancy Wake for Halloween all over the world. They should be.
Absolutely.
But they're not, because at least in America, most people don't know of her. And I think it's because she wasn't American and she wasn't a man. So I decided that I would do what little I could to help people become aware of her, because we shouldn't lose stories like that.
No, and I mean, it is an incredible story. And the whole time I was reading it, I would say, like, she's probably exaggerating. She probably made this part up. That couldn't possibly. And then I got to the author's note, and you were like, oh, yeah, I took that from the autobiography. I mean, the whole story is fascinating. But also, you talk in the author's note about your research process. Could you talk a little bit more about that aspect of writing the book?
I have this theory that everyone has gaps in their education. None of us graduate knowing everything that we should know about what's going on in the world. So every novel that I have approached, for me at least, has been a way to fill some of the gaps in my own education. My first novel, I got to learn about jazz-age New York City. My second novel, I got to learn about Zeppelin airships and the Hindenburg. And my third novel was the Russian Revolution and the Romanovs. This novel was the French Resistance. As I approached this novel, I relied heavily on Nancy's own autobiography and then 3 others that were written about her. So she was able to give a number of interviews before she died. They're fascinating, and she remained fun her entire life. And then I got to work. When I write novels like this, I stick to the historical record. If it is established in history, I do not change it. Some of my novels have been what could have happened. This one, thankfully, all of the details were there. I just had to piece them together like a giant jigsaw puzzle. My job was to read it and to understand it and then put it together within the structure of how I wanted to tell the story. And in this case, I wanted to tell it sort of in 4 parts using the 4 different code names that Nancy used during the war. Mm-hmm. And it's linear. The story goes linear, but we begin with Nancy literally parachuting out of an airplane. And then in the next chapter, we drop back 8 years earlier and start another track in which we watch Nancy become the kind of woman who could jump out of an airplane. And the reason that I wanted to do it that way, and I get a lot of questions on the structure, is early on in my research, I read 2 really fascinating things about her. The first was that in her early days as a journalist, she was sent to interview Adolf Hitler shortly after he was appointed chancellor in Germany. And then the second thing that fascinated me is toward the end of the war, she kills a Nazi with her bare hands.
Yes, she does.
So how does a woman, yes, she does. So how does a woman go from interviewing Hitler to, well, really to becoming a Nazi killer? I couldn't get those 2 images out of my head, and I really wanted to explore that transformation, to be young, to be naive, to becoming lethal.
Yeah, it really is incredible to watch her transformation. So you mentioned that early in the book, Nancy jumps out of a plane. It's the opening scene. She's in the plane, and she stops and puts on red lipstick. I'm remembering that correctly, right? Mm-hmm. And that victory red lipstick becomes a touch point for her throughout the novel. And it just feels so perfect. Can you talk about why you chose that specific item?
I don't know the specific shade that Nancy used, only that it was Elizabeth Arden, but she did stop and put on lipstick. And I actually was talking to a friend of mine recently, a male reader, and he was like, Ariel, you almost lost me at that lipstick scene. I mean, really, she's putting on lipstick before she jumps out of a plane. And I was like, listen, I don't put stuff like that in unless it really happened. And you have to agree that it was really important throughout the rest of the novel. And he did. He agreed. But for Nancy, and I think for a lot of women at that time, there was something really fortifying about lipstick. The United States Army issued a special edition of Elizabeth Arden lipstick called Victory Red, and they gave it to all of the U.S. female service members. And these women wore it as a badge of honor, in no small part because the Nazi regime did not like women to wear makeup. And there were early articles and women's magazine articles with headlines that would say, beauty is your duty. But for Nancy specifically in the book, the lipstick is a form of armor. And she puts it on religiously before any tense situation because she knows it is disarming. She's stuck out there with all of these men. She's the only woman amidst thousands of men. And I think at one point in the book, she says, when you wear lipstick, men don't see a warrior, they see a woman. Mm-hmm. She would use that sense of being underestimated to her advantage. And I learned so much from her about that one small detail. I got to where I would put it on in the mornings before I wrote the book. I'd sit down and I would have this massive amount of work ahead of me and I would feel overwhelmed. And I'd put on the red lipstick.
There's a whole lot of drinking in this book. Like, that became another tool in her arsenal, was the ability to outdrink these men.
Yes. So her husband teaches her three things throughout the course of the novel. And you don't realize it at the time, but each of these three things becomes an incredibly powerful tool that she uses later when she is embedded with the French resistance as a way to gain dominance over all of these men. He teaches her to curse. That really happened. Drink in such a way that she can basically drink anyone under the table. That really happened. And as an adult, he taught her to ride a bike. She did not know how to ride a bike until she was an adult. And that sounds like a silly thing until you get to a certain point in the book in which you realize it really matters. Mm-hmm. So those three lessons that he taught her were ways that I could include his voice in the novel. And they became vital to the work she had to do to win the war.
You know, what struck me as I was reading it, it's very much a spy story. There is Nazi killing, there are weapons, but it's also very much a love story. And that love story is essential to the novel. And I loved the role reversal of it. Nancy went out and did all the things, and Henri, taught her what she needed to know and then kind of tended things on the home front. Can you talk a little more about what their relationship was like and maybe parts that didn't make it into the book?
Well, I live in a house with 5 male humans, so the male voice is fairly familiar to me. Not the French male voice. That was harder. But to answer your question, I loved their role reversal as well. And like you said, I'd never read a war story where the woman went off to battle and the man stayed home to hold down the home front. And again, it really happened. And I thought that there was something really special there. There was this sense of modernization, if that's the right word, to their relationship. They were ahead of the times. She was not content to sit home and knit him scarves while he went off to war. And he didn't feel obliged to make her do that. Yeah. And I loved this give and take they have as intellectual equals. And there's this mutual respect there. And I can't say that he loved the fact that he went off or he let her run off and go to war. I don't know that any man would love to see his wife go to war. But he was willing to do it because he knew it was the thing she felt called to do and that she needed to do. And also, as a woman, there were things that she could accomplish that men couldn't. The smuggling, for instance, she went under the radar for so long because nobody expected a loud, brassy, lipstick-wearing woman to be a successful smuggler. I loved writing about them because I do believe in fidelity, and I do love marriages. I love seeing good marriages in print. And I think I talk about this a little bit in the author's note. I understand why the bad marriages get all the airtime in fiction. They're easier to write. The conflict is already there. And it's very hard to write a good marriage because good marriages are boring. They should be. A good marriage, not much happens, and that's the way you want it. And personally, I mean, I've been married almost 20 years. I really love being married, and I love my husband. And I would, just as a reader in general, I would love to see more good marriages in print. And I have this theory that readers do as well. Like if you look at the Outlander books, there's a good marriage at the heart of that series. If you look at Louise Penny's novels, there's a good marriage at the heart of that series. Some of my favorite books, some of my favorite series have a really tender, good marriage at their heart.
So after the events of the book, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but after the events of the book, you know, Nancy continues to lead a really extraordinary life. Are you at all tempted to write her continuing adventures?
Oh, I go back and forth. Okay, so this is not a spoiler. It does not affect the book at all. Nancy passed away in 2011 at the age of 99. And between 1945, sort of roughly when the book closes, and 2011, she did so many more extraordinary things. As an example, after the war, she returned to Australia and ran for public office a number of times and did not win because she was a woman. And I think so much of Nancy's story, from her being a journalist in the early days and not getting a byline, to all of what she did during the war, to after the war, it taking so long for her to be awarded various medals. Mm-hmm. So much of what she did in her life, she did not get the credit for because she was a woman. And I think that is one of the parts of her story that remains relevant today. Every woman I know has worked hard for something and not gotten the credit. And Nancy has a lot to teach us about how to handle that and how to pick up and move on and how we live amidst tragedy and injustice and disappointment. And so to answer your question, yes, I thought about it. I have no idea if I'll ever do anything about it.
Okay. Well, if you do, I will be first in line to read it. I want to shift just a little bit and talk about your journey to publication. Your first book was The Wife, the Maid, and the Mistress. How did you go from aspiring author to published author with that book?
Oh, that's a great question. To be honest with you, being an author is the only thing I have ever wanted to do. From the time I was 5 years old, I knew that I wanted to do this, and I never really changed. I'm a little bit unique amongst my writer friends, at least, in that I did not go to school for this. I didn't go to college at all. I left home at 16. I worked and I traveled, and I taught myself both the craft of writing and the craft of storytelling, which I believe are intertwined. I think you have to master both of those crafts. And once I stopped having babies, I seriously started working toward that dream of being a novelist. And for me, I can't speak for anyone else, it all happened quite suddenly. I finished my novel. I was connected to the agent that I wanted to work with most anyway. Her name is Elizabeth Weed. We emailed a couple times. She asked to see the book. Funny story, it wasn't actually finished when she asked to see it. And I panicked because I knew that I only got one shot. So I told her, I was like, I will send it as soon as it's done. And then I didn't write back for 6 months while I finished. And much to my eternal shock, she loved the book and asked to represent me and submitted it. And it went to auction and sold. And I'm still looking around going, what happened? Did anyone just see that? Is this really happening? Am I dreaming? I know that that's kind of a different story. I still don't know the how or why of the circumstances. I'm really grateful for them, though.
Well, and it's well-deserved.
Oh, thank you.
So what's next for you?
So my next subject is a woman named Martha Ballard, and she was a midwife in Maine in the late 1700s. She was the aunt of Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, and she was the great-grandmother of one of the first female physicians in the United States. the legacy she's left on the medical community is fascinating. But the reason I'm writing about her is because she kept a diary for 30 years at a time when most women could neither read nor write. And in this diary is recorded every secret, every scandal, every birth, every death, every murder, every event that happened in her village over those 30 years. So I'm standing at the bottom of Everest and looking up and going, whew, this is going to be a lot of work, but worth it.
Well, it sounds incredible. I can't wait to read it. So we always wrap up by asking, what have you been reading or watching or listening to that you've really loved?
Another good question. And I finished just a few days ago Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel.
Oh, yes.
I'd never read it. I've owned it since it was published, and it's been sitting on my bookshelf taunting me. And I didn't read it because I was afraid. Not afraid of the subject matter, but afraid that I would want to quit. It's a thing that happens to me when I read a really, really brilliant book. I kind of sit there and go, well, I'm done. I quit. But I chose to read it now because we are in a pandemic, and it is about a global pandemic. And I thought, I hope I never have the opportunity to read this book again during a global pandemic. But I wanted to read it through the lens of what was happening all around us. And it was a fascinating way to read that particular book. I don't know, the parallels were fascinating as I read. Finished that one a few days ago, and then earlier this week I picked up the new Hunger Games book by Suzanne Collins,
Oh, yes.
The Ballad of Snakes, or Snakes and Songbirds. Again, sort of a post-apocalyptic novel set amidst a society struggling to overcome a lot of things. So I don't know what that says about my mental state at the moment. Connect those dots as you will. Honestly, I think there's great comfort in reading these novels because everything works out okay in the end. And who doesn't want to believe right now that everything's going to work out okay?
And I think that was part of what I enjoyed so much about your book is, I mean, obviously, World War II, the French Resistance, it's a terrible, terrible time. But Nancy is just so inspiring, and I'm so grateful that you wrote the book and gave me the chance to learn more about her. And I'm telling my daughters, oh my gosh, you have to read this book. It's amazing. This woman is incredible. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm really delighted that you loved it.
Well, I want to thank you again, Ariel, for coming on the podcast. We're so appreciative that you took the time, and we are wishing you and Code Name Hélène the very best of luck.
Thank you so much. This was really fun. Thank you for having me on.
Listeners, Code Name Hélène is available in both Libby and Cloud Library as an ebook and e-audiobook, as well as print and large type. We also have Ariel's other books in our catalog, so you can enjoy her backlist. Our website is www.cooklib.org. While you're there, take a look at Shelf Life, the library's blog where we regularly share what's new and interesting in books, movies, and music. The blog's address is shelflife.cooklib.org. If you ever want to get in touch and leave some feedback, send a message to us at webmaster@cooklib.org. If you enjoy this podcast, share it with those you love. And one of the best things you can do to support us is take a moment to leave a rating or review. Those really help us get the podcast noticed. We'll be back soon, but until then, keep reading, keep watching, and keep listening.